Welcome to Time in History. I'm Professor Bill. The Old West is often remembered as legend, but history survives in photographs. Each image captures a moment exactly as it was. Some were celebrated, some exposed uncomfortable truths, and some quietly challenged the story we think we know. Tonight, we step back into those frames. Look closely. On February 1st, 1893, thousands gathered in Paris, Texas, not for a festival, but for a public killing. Henry Smith, accused of murder, was tortured and burned before a cheering crowd. The execution was advertised in advance. Special trains brought spectators. This wasn't law enforcement. It was spectacle. And it tells us more about the West than any duel at high noon ever could. In 1867, high in the Sierra Nevada, thousands of Chinese laborers carved tunnels through solid granite. They hung from ropes over cliffs, drilling holes by hand and packing them with explosives. More than 12,000 men worked on the railroad, and many never made it home. The myth says cowboys built the West. The photographs show something different. Annie Oakley was one of the most famous shooters in the world by the 1890s. She could split a playing card at 30 paces. She toured internationally and outperformed most men on stage. The West wasn't just saloons and sheriffs. It was also women who refused to fit the roles history tried to give them. On many frontier ranches, boys began working before they reached 10 years old. Days started before sunrise and ended after dark. There were no labor laws, no protections. Childhood on the frontier was short and often dangerous. The West promised freedom, but for many it demanded survival first. Many settlers who claimed land under the Homestead Act didn't build wooden houses. There were no trees. Instead, they carved homes directly into the earth. These sod houses were dark, damp, and fragile. The frontier wasn't built from polished wood and swinging doors. It was carved from soil and endurance. Dodge City is often remembered as a lawless battlefield, but historical records tell a different story. In some years, the town saw only a handful of homicides, far fewer than many American cities a century later. The West was violent, but not in the theatrical way Hollywood imagined. By the 1880s, the Pinkerton Agency had more operatives than the U.S. Army. They tracked outlaws, but they also broke labor strikes. Corporations hired them to control workers and protect profits. The West wasn't only ruled by sheriffs. It was shaped by private power. In 1864, U.S. militia attacked a Cheyenne and Arapaho camp at Sand Creek. Most of the dead were women and children. The event shocked even members of Congress. Yet it was only one of many such conflicts across the frontier. The West was not empty land. It was already someone's home. In 1876, Deadwood exploded almost overnight after gold was discovered. Thousands arrived chasing fortune. Gambling halls multiplied faster than churches. Fortunes were made in weeks and lost in hours. The West wasn't only about land. It was about risk. In 1879, thousands of formerly enslaved families left the South and moved west to Kansas. They were called exodusters. They weren't chasing gold. They were chasing safety. For many, the West was not adventure. It was escape. The Yuma Territorial Prison opened in 1876 in the Arizona Territory. Inmates quarried stone and built the prison themselves. The facility held murderers, thieves, and women convicted of frontier crimes. Conditions were severe, but not chaotic. The West did not operate without prisons. It developed institutions, often harsh, but structured. The iconic cowboy was not usually a wealthy gunslinger. He was a wage laborer, paid roughly $30 to $40 a month for months on the trail. Nearly 1 in 4 cowboys was African American. The frontier workforce was more diverse and more working class than popular memory suggests. Railroad corporations received millions of acres of federal land. They controlled freight rates and access to markets. Farmers depended on their pricing decisions. The West was not purely individualistic. It was shaped by corporate capital and federal policy. Drought in the 1880s devastated thousands of homesteads. Crops failed. Loans could not be repaid. Many families abandoned their claims. The frontier offered opportunity, but it also carried environmental risk that few fully understood. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral lasted roughly 30 seconds, yet it became one of the defining legends of the American West. A brief exchange of gunfire was transformed into mythology. The West we remember was edited. The West these photographs show was lived. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres of land to anyone willing to live on it for 5 years. But claiming that land required paperwork, witnesses, and repeated inspections. Nearly half of all homestead claims were eventually canceled. The frontier was not simply open space. It was regulated, documented, and closely monitored by federal officials. By the 1870s, the American West was dotted with military forts. Fort Laramie served as a strategic base along major migration routes. Soldiers protected rail lines, escorted settlers, and enforced federal treaties. Expansion across the plains was not accidental. It was directed and defended by the United States Army. Contrary to popular myth, many Western towns maintained formal courts. Judges, juries, and written statutes governed daily disputes. Trials were often brief, but they were recorded. Law on the frontier was imperfect, yet it existed. In 1892, powerful cattle barons in Wyoming hired gunmen to eliminate small ranchers they accused of rustling. The conflict escalated into an armed siege at the TA Ranch. The United States Army was eventually deployed to prevent further bloodshed. This was not a duel between outlaws. It was a corporate war over land and economic control. The Lincoln County War began as a business dispute between rival merchant factions. Contracts, credit lines, and supply monopolies were at stake. Violence followed when legal authority proved weak. Among those involved was a young outlaw, later known as Billy the Kid. What became legend started as economic competition. In the early 19th century, tens of millions of buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By the late 1870s, only a few hundred remained. Industrial hunting, railroad expansion, and federal military strategy accelerated their destruction. The near extinction of the buffalo reshaped the balance of power across the plains. Environmental collapse was part of Western expansion. In 1882, a massive fire destroyed much of Tombstone, Arizona. Wooden buildings and dry conditions made frontier towns highly vulnerable. Reconstruction often began immediately, but not all residents returned. Western towns were fragile structures. Many disappeared as quickly as they emerged. On December 29, 1890, U.S. troops opened fire on a Lakota encampment at Wounded Knee. Estimates suggest that nearly 300 people were killed. Many were women and children. The event marked the effective end of large-scale armed resistance on the plains. The closing chapter of the so-called Wild West was written in military force. In September 1857, a wagon train traveling through Utah Territory was attacked at Mountain Meadows. Approximately 120 emigrants were killed. The massacre reflected deep political and religious tensions in the region. Frontier conflict was not always between settlers and tribes. It could erupt within settler society itself. On May 10, 1869, the Golden Spike Ceremony marked the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Executives and officials posed for the camera. Absent from the center of the image were the thousands of Chinese laborers who made the project possible. The photograph captured triumph. It did not capture everyone who built it. Following the events at Wounded Knee, 20 U.S. soldiers received the Medal of Honor. The awards were granted under the standards of the time. Historians continue to debate their appropriateness. The legacy of the frontier is not settled. It remains contested. In 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first federal law to ban immigration based solely on nationality. Chinese laborers who had helped build railroads and mining towns were now legally barred from entry. The West was not only expanding, it was defining who was allowed to belong. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided tribal lands into individual plots. Communal ownership was replaced with private titles. Millions of acres were declared surplus and transferred to non-native settlers. The policy was presented as assimilation. In practice, it accelerated land loss on an enormous scale. In 1894, the Pullman strike paralyzed rail traffic across the country, including Western lines. Federal troops were deployed to restore operations. Clashes between workers and soldiers resulted in fatalities. The West was tied to national industry. Its conflicts were no longer purely local. By the 1880s, the West was already being turned into entertainment. Buffalo Bill's traveling show reenacted battles and frontier drama for paying audiences. Former soldiers and native performers appeared on stage. The myth of the Wild West did not emerge decades later. It was manufactured in real time. In 1890, the ghost dance movement spread across Lakota communities. It was a spiritual response to loss, land, autonomy, and way of life. Participants believed the dance would restore balance and remove colonial presence. Federal authorities interpreted it as a threat. Fear, not gunfire, set the final chain of events in motion. Between 1876 and 1885, fewer than 20 homicides were recorded in Dodge City. Most gun-related violence was isolated and brief. The image of constant street duels emerged later through dime novels and film. The statistics tell a quieter story. The frontier was unstable, but rarely theatrical. Stagecoach robberies became iconic symbols of the Wild West. In reality, they were statistically uncommon compared to the volume of mail and passenger transport. Most routes operated without incident. The rare exception became the rule in popular memory. Drama proved more durable than data. Frontier newspapers competed for readers in rapidly growing towns. Sensational headlines sold more copies. Gunfights and outlaws were amplified beyond their frequency. Media on the frontier did not merely report events. It shaped perception. In 1903, the Great Train Robbery helped define the cinematic West. Gunmen, trains, pursuit, compressed into dramatic narrative. By the time the real frontier closed, its fictional version was just beginning. The Wild West survived not in history, but in film. By the 1910s, many who had lived through the frontier era were elderly. Journalists sought their memories. Stories were retold, sometimes simplified, sometimes embellished. Personal recollection became public mythology. Memory does not preserve events exactly as they occurred. It preserves what feels meaningful. Towns like Tombstone began marketing their past. Former sites of conflict became destinations. Gunfights were reenacted for visitors. The West transitioned from lived experience to curated attraction. By 1900, open-range cattle driving was declining. Barbed wire divided the plains. Large ranching operations replaced small independent outfits. The cowboy, as roaming icon, gave way to organized agricultural industry. By the early 20th century, the cowboy had become a marketing symbol. Cigarettes, boots, and clothing brands adopted frontier imagery. The rugged individual became a commercial identity. The West was no longer a place. It was a product. Within a single generation, the physical frontier became a cinematic backdrop. Real streets were replaced by constructed facades. Complexity was replaced by narrative clarity. The West that survived into the 20th century was the version easiest to film. On April 22, 1889, thousands waited along the Oklahoma border. At noon, a signal was given, and they rushed forward to claim land. Some arrived early and hid inside the territory, earning the nickname Sooners. The frontier was not always gradual expansion. Sometimes, it was a starting gun. Barbed wire, patented in 1874, transformed the West more effectively than any revolver. Open range gave way to fenced property. Conflict erupted between cattle drivers and farmers. Freedom on the plains became regulated space. The frontier was closing, not symbolically, but physically. Not every homestead succeeded. Drought, debt, and isolation forced many families to abandon their claims. The frontier promised opportunity. It also delivered attrition. For every success story, there were silent departures. Federal boarding schools sought to assimilate Native children into American society. Traditional language and dress were often prohibited. The policy aimed to erase cultural identity. The frontier was not only about land, it was about redefining identity itself. The 1890 census declared that the frontier line no longer existed. Settlement had become continuous. The era of open expansion was officially considered closed. The Wild West did not fade away slowly. It was administratively concluded. By the 1890s, the West was increasingly industrial. Rail hubs connected mining towns, farms, and cities. Telegraph lines followed the tracks. What had once been distant frontier became integrated infrastructure. Expansion was no longer movement. It was maintenance. Cheap printed novels popularized frontier adventure across the country. Stories of lone gunmen and heroic lawmen sold in the millions. The audience often lived far from the actual West. Fiction filled the distance between reality and imagination. By 1915, California studios were producing Western films at scale. Artificial towns replaced real ones. Stories were simplified for dramatic clarity. The cinematic West became standardized, repeatable, portable, profitable. During the Great Depression, Western films experienced renewed popularity. Audiences facing economic hardship looked to simplified frontier narratives. The cowboy symbolized resilience and independence. The West became emotional reassurance. When the Census Bureau declared the frontier closed in 1890, it marked the end of an administrative boundary. The land remained. The stories remained. What changed was perception. The West shifted from geography to memory. By the 1890s, the frontier was no longer defined by open land. It was defined by ownership. Under the Homestead Act, settlers received 160 acres after 5 years of residence and cultivation. But the final step was paperwork. When a land patent was issued, federal territory officially became private property. Between 1862 and the early 20th century, over 270 million acres were distributed this way. The mythology of the West celebrates freedom. The documentation reveals administration. The frontier did not end with gunfire. It ended with signatures. After the Civil War, federal survey teams moved across the West with instruments, not rifles. They measured rivers, mapped mountain ranges, and cataloged mineral deposits. What had once been described as wilderness was converted into data. Coordinates replaced rumors. Elevation replaced legend. The frontier was no longer unknown. It was calculated. By the 1890s, the most powerful buildings in many Western towns were not saloons. They were banks. Railroads required financing. Ranches required loans. Farmers purchased equipment on credit. The West did not run on gunpowder. It ran on interest rates. Debt tied remote towns to eastern capital markets. The frontier myth celebrates independence. The financial record shows integration. By the 1890s, the frontier was raising a second generation. In one-room schoolhouses scattered across the plains, children learned standardized English, arithmetic, and national history. Education was not incidental. It was structural. Railroads connected the territory. Schools connected identity. The West was no longer simply being settled. It was being normalized. The frontier is often imagined as isolated. By the 1890s, regular mail routes connected even remote Western towns to the rest of the country. Letters carried contracts, news, court notices, and personal correspondence. Communication reduced distance. The West was no longer detached from national life. It was synchronized with it.